Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today we're jumping right into Psalm 8, looking at it through the lens of John Calvin's commentary.
You know, this psalm doesn't start quietly. It kicks off with this huge declaration.
So we're going to dig into that. Why does the psalmist start with this sense of awe? And what's he building on from there?
So we'll start with that opening exclamation. Then look at this big contrast between God's majesty and our frailty. We'll see how he uses infants and man's dominion as proof of God's goodness, how Christ restores all that, and then how the whole thing just circles right back to that opening line.
All right, let's get into it. The overwhelming exclamation. David just bursts onto the scene with this. But, before we even get to the why, there's this little technical term in the title of the psalm that people always ask about. And that term is gittith. So what does it mean?
Well, the short answer is, we're not totally sure. It could be a type of instrument, maybe a specific tune, or even the first line of some other song that was well known back then. Calvin, he just dismisses the idea that it was written in the city of Gath. He calls that strained and far-fetched. In the end, he says the specific meaning just isn't that big of a deal. The real point is what the psalmist says, and it starts with this feeling of being just completely overwhelmed by God's goodness.
So what is it that has him so overwhelmed? It's the name of God. Now, Calvin is super clear here. This isn't about God's hidden essence or something like that. It's about what we can know of his character, what he's revealed through everything he's made and done. David feels like his senses are just swallowed up, so he can't just state a fact, he has to exclaim it. Words aren't big enough.
So why start this way? Well, because the whole subject of God's goodness is, frankly, incomprehensible. David knows he's not up to the task of describing it properly. And this exclamation, it's also meant to kind of shake us awake, to pull us out of our indifference and get us to look at what David calls the brightest mirror of God's glory, which is his goodness toward us, toward mankind. And to show just how great this goodness is, David sets up this really stark contrast.
Yeah, he puts God's incredible majesty right next to our own human weakness to really make a point.
And just look at this contrast. On one side, you've got thy heavens, the works of thy fingers, the moon, the stars, and on the other side, you've got man. The Hebrew word used here is enosh, and it really gets at the idea of frailty. We're called dust and clay, poor worms of the earth. And that's what's so incredible, right? That the creator of the entire universe would even bother himself with a creature like man?
Okay, so after setting up that huge contrast, David gives his first piece of evidence to show God's specific care for us, and he starts in a place you would never expect.
He argues that God's providence, his care, is so obvious that it shines out right from the very dawn of infancy. He even calls infants invincible champions, whose very existence is enough to shut down the arguments of the ungodly.
How? How do they do that? Well, first, there's their nourishment. God does this amazing thing, changing blood into milk, perfectly ready for them when they're born. Second, their skill. Babies have this mysterious instinct, this built-in ability to suck and feed themselves. And third, their power. David says their speechless mouth contains God's mature strength. The point is, God doesn't need some huge army to defeat his enemies. The mouths of little children are more than enough.
All right, let's get to the second big proof. After talking about infants, David points to the high position God gave mankind right at the beginning, at creation.
And this honor he's talking about has two parts. First, man was crowned with glory and honor. This is talking about the internal stuff, the qualities that show we were made in God's image.
So what does that include? Things like having reason, being able to tell good from evil, having the idea of religion planted inside us, the social bonds that hold us all together, even having a sense of what's proper, a sense of shame. All these things point to a wisdom that isn't from us, but from above. Then there's the second honor, which is external. The dominion, the rule man was given as God's representative here on earth. And this rule covered everything, all the livestock, the wildlife, the birds in the sky, and the fish in the sea. But when you look at the world today, this brings up a pretty big question, doesn't it? If that was our original state, what on earth happened?
And this is where the commentary takes us straight to the fall of man. That original, perfect order of creation, that incredible dominion we had, it was all thrown into confusion when Adam sinned. Because of the fall, mankind didn't just lose its dominion, it was captured and held in what Calvin calls a degrading and ignominious bondage. The very image of God in us was almost wiped out. But thankfully, that's not where the story ends.
This is where we see the solution. Everything that was lost in Adam is recovered in Christ. Christ is the rightful heir of all things. He's the one who restores mankind, and through him, believers get back what was lost. Even now, we get to enjoy fragments of the good things that were given up in the fall. So let's tie this all together now and get back to that main exclamation from the beginning.
The whole point of this psalm, really, is to celebrate God's fatherly goodness to us. And that goodness becomes so much clearer, so much brighter, when you see it next to our own weakness and against the backdrop of the massive, glorious creation.
And that's why the psalm ends exactly how it began. The entire reflection on creation, our weakness, our dominion, and its restoration is bracketed on both ends by this one powerful statement of awe at God's revealed character.
So that leaves us with something to think about. If we really view humanity this way, through this lens of God's majesty, our own frailty, and his incredible goodness, how does that change the way we live our day-to-day lives? Thanks for joining us for this explainer.